At sunrise, a broken gunsight lens washed ashore on a quiet Pacific beach, its center split cleanly in two and its edges darkened by heat. No one knew which aircraft it belonged to or why it had separated in midair. But within hours, the truth behind that shattered piece of glass would force the entire carrier group to rethink a battle they believed they understood. The broken gunsight lens lay under a modest sheet of protective glass in the center of the operations table, illuminated by a single lamp that cast soft shadows across its fractured surface. It had been recovered only hours earlier, discovered at dawn on a quiet stretch of sand several miles west of the carrier's patrol route. The lens was unmistakably from an F-6F Hellcat, its thickness and curvature familiar to every pilot who had ever looked through one during an approach. Yet the clarity of the fracture, spreading outward in a perfect radial pattern, suggested a force far more precise than random impact with water or debris. Its edges were darkened by localized heat, as though something had struck it with sudden intensity before the aircraft descended. Officers gathered around the table studied the fragment with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The previous night's engagement with a small group of Japanese fighters had seemed brief and routine, the kind of encounter that produced evasive maneuvers and scattered bursts of fire, but rarely serious damage. No pilot had reported difficulties, and no distress call echoed through the radio channels. The formation had returned to the carrier mostly intact, their silhouettes emerging from darkness one after another, except for a single aircraft that never appeared on the horizon. The missing Hellcat had become an unresolved detail until the discovery of the lens shifted the weight of the morning. A gunsight lens did not separate easily. It was secured within reinforced metal brackets designed to withstand vibration, recoil, and even minor impacts. For it to break away entirely required an intense moment of force within the cockpit, something that occurred abruptly and with enough violence to split the glass before the aircraft touched the ocean. The fact that the lens washed ashore intact, rather than shattering into smaller fragments, suggested it detached at altitude and drifted separately from the airframe. This raised uncomfortable possibilities. If the lens broke mid-flight, the pilot would have suddenly lost one of his primary targeting and orientation references, especially in low visibility. A cracked gunsight could scatter light unpredictably, distort the horizon, and force the pilot to rely on instinct while under threat. Yet the descent pattern reconstructed from radar traces implied control, not panic. The aircraft had not plunged, it had glided. As the officers examined the lens, a quiet realization settled across the room. The fragment did not merely represent damage. It represented the first clue in a sequence they had not yet assembled. Something had unfolded during the engagement that no one had seen, something powerful enough to break the lens cleanly and redirect the final minutes of the flight. The story of that missing pilot would have to be rebuilt piece by piece, starting with the thin shard of fractured glass lying silently before them. The hours just after dawn carried a muted heaviness across the carrier's deck, the sort of quiet weight that did not come from danger itself, but from the uneasy knowledge that something important had slipped past unnoticed. The sea was calm beneath the slow-rising light, its surface shifting in long ripples that disguised whatever traces remained from the previous night's encounter. Men moved with steady purpose along the deck, but their voices were subdued, their glances quick and searching, as though each of them sensed a question silently working its way through the ship's steel corridors. Lieutenant Mark Halden felt it too as he stepped into the operations room, still carrying on his uniform the faint grit left from the night patrol he had returned from only a few hours earlier. The room was dim, lit mostly by the soft glow of radar consoles warming for the day's cycle. Several crewmen were already gathered around the central table, where the worn gunnery logbook lay open beside a cracked and clouded gunsight lens. an object that had become the focus of quiet speculation since the moment it was found. It had been discovered wedged beneath loose equipment on Halden's aircraft during post-flight checks, though no one could yet explain how it ended up there. Its fractures were strange, radiating outward in a pattern that looked less like ordinary impact damage and more like something had pressed against it from the inside. Halden had turned it over several times the previous night, unsettled by the way light caught the splintered surface and revealed shapes that didn't quite match standard stress marks. Captain Reeves stood at the far end of the table, leaning over a spread of reconnaissance sketches from the patrol routes assigned to Halden's squadron. His expression was thoughtful but tight, the look of a man trying to understand a problem that refused to form into something recognizable. When he greeted Halden, his voice held a calmness that did not disguise the underlying concern. He motioned toward the cracked lens and asked whether Halden had noticed anything during the patrol that might explain its condition. Halden hesitated before answering, not wanting to give shape to the unease he had felt in the dark sky hours earlier, when a brief shimmer of reflected light had appeared at the edge of his gun sight. He had dismissed it at the time as distortion from the ocean's surface, but now, seeing the lens broken in such an unusual way, he wondered if he had overlooked something important. The crew chief joined them, placing a set of maintenance notes beside the logbook. His findings only deepened the uncertainty. No structural stress had been recorded on the aircraft. No loose gear had shifted during flight. Nothing in the cockpit showed signs of impact or vibration strong enough to damage the lens. The chief tapped the table lightly, indicating the pattern of the fractures again, radiating outward as though responding to a force not yet understood. The men exchanged quiet looks. In wartime, unexplained details were rarely dismissed lightly. Even a small anomaly could signal something larger, waiting just beyond the horizon of routine patrols. As the morning light strengthened, Reeves closed the logbook and instructed the men to proceed with their planned flight briefing. The lens remained on the table, its fractured surface catching the pale glow of the consoles. Halden lingered for a moment, examining it once more before joining the others. There was something about it he could not shake, something that suggested their night patrol had crossed paths with more than empty sky. The unanswered question hung in the air around him as he stepped away, the ship humming steadily beneath his feet while the day's operations began to unfold. The briefing room settled into a measured stillness as the squadron gathered around the wide plotting board. The low scrape of chairs and the faint rustle of flight papers were the only sounds as Lieutenant Mark Halden took his seat near the center. Morning sunlight filtered through the narrow portholes, casting thin, slanted beams across the room that illuminated drifting flecks of dust and the tired faces of pilots who had flown through the night only hours earlier. Yet even fatigue could not fully mask the undercurrent of quiet anticipation threading through the group, an awareness that today's patrol carried a weight different from the routine cycles they had grown used to. Captain Reeves stood at the front, his posture controlled, his gaze sharpened. He began outlining the revised patrol sectors on the board, marking each route with decisive strokes of red pencil. His movements were precise, but Halden noticed how the captain avoided looking toward the small side table where the cracked gunsight lens had been placed earlier. It rested beside the maintenance notes like an uninvited witness, its fractured surface catching occasional glints of light that seemed to pulse with each shift of the ship beneath them. No one mentioned it, but every man in the room knew it was there. Reeves spoke of an unusual radar echo recorded shortly before dawn, a faint signal trailing the squadron's flight path from the previous night. It had appeared briefly, then vanished, leaving behind only a few seconds of distorted data that analysts were still trying to interpret. He did not claim it was significant, but the slight edge in his tone suggested otherwise. The Navy did not adjust patrol sectors without reason. especially when fuel, daylight, and risk had to be balanced carefully. The shift in their route meant something had drawn command's attention, a possibility that settled heavily across the pilots. Halden found his thoughts drifting back to the moment the odd shimmer had appeared against his gun sight, lingering just long enough to feel out of place. He had dismissed it as atmospheric distortion, yet the memory pressed forward now, aligning uncomfortably with the cracked lens on the table. He wondered whether the radar echo and the damage could somehow be connected, though he could not imagine how. The sky had been clear, the water calm, and his instruments steady. There had been no sudden pressure change, no jolt, no sign of debris. And yet something had touched that lens. Reeves continued the briefing, detailing flight spacing, radio intervals, and enemy movement reports from adjacent sectors. The routine information grounded the men, giving structure to uncertainty. Still, a subtle tension lingered, less about danger and more about the sense that the day's flight might bring clarity to a question none of them had spoken aloud. The quiet glances exchanged across the table confirmed it. Every pilot was aware that their squadron might be heading toward whatever had brushed up against Halden's gun sight the night before. When the captain finished, he dismissed them to conduct pre-flight checks. The men stood, gathering their gear with the calm efficiency of those who understood rhythm more than reason. Halden remained seated for a moment, his hand resting on the edge of the table as he looked once more at the lens. The fractures seemed almost to converge at a single point near the center, as though something had pressed outward in a slow, deliberate motion. It was a strange pattern, unlike the clean starburst typical of impact damage. He felt again a faint unease, a quiet intuition that the previous night's encounter had been more than a fleeting distortion in the sky. He rose finally and followed the others toward the hangar deck. The roar of engines warming for sortie grew louder with each step, vibrating through the steel floor in steady, rhythmic pulses. Mechanics moved swiftly between aircraft, their gestures choreographed by long months of practice. The morning air carried the sharp scent of fuel, mingled with the faint tang of salt drifting in from the open sea. As Halden approached his plane, he paused. The canopy had been cleaned, the instrumentation rechecked, yet the memory of the fractured lens remained vivid. Today's flight would not be routine. Whatever lay beyond their patrol route, whatever had left its mark on his gun sight, was waiting in the vast, quiet stretch of ocean that lay before them. The hours that followed the failed interception unfolded with a strange quietness across the carrier group, a quietness shaped not by calm, but by the weight of something unresolved. Reports moved slowly through the narrow corridors, passed from hand to hand, each carrying fragments of what the radar crews believed they had seen during the pre-dawn sweep. No one could agree whether it had been a drifting echo, a misaligned bearing, or a Japanese scout that had slipped through a gap no one expected to exist. Yet beneath the technical debates lay a far more troubling question. Why had the returning patrol reported that same gap as clear only minutes after their near miss? Inside the operations room, Lieutenant Halden reviewed the plotted tracks again, his pencil tapping lightly against the chart, tracing the same looping path he had followed earlier. The strange reading, the isolated blip, sat where it had before, like a quiet interruption in an otherwise predictable pattern. It had not behaved like aircraft they were used to tracking. It drifted. It faded. It brightened for a moment, as though illuminated by something unseen. Then, without explanation, it vanished into the noise. What unsettled Halden was not simply that it had appeared, but that it had appeared after the patrol had signaled the lens failure, as if the two events were somehow connected. Later in the morning, Halden visited the deck where the cracked gunsight lens had been set aside for inspection. The object rested beneath a canvas tarp, its fractured surface catching the light in thin, sharp reflections. The crack itself was unusual. It did not radiate outward like typical stress fractures seen after hard landings. Instead, it curved in a smooth crescent, almost symmetrical, as though shaped by a sudden pulse of pressure or heat. The armor had no explanation. Neither did the pilot who had brought it in. Halden lifted it gently, rotating it toward the sun, and the surface shimmered faintly with a distortion he could not quite place. It reminded him of heat waves rising from metal at midday. Only this was morning, and the air was cool. Back in the chart room, the navigation officer pointed out a detail Halden had missed. The radar blip had aligned almost perfectly with the returning patrol's final magnetic heading during the moments their equipment malfunctioned. It was as if the signal had been following the aircraft rather than approaching from a distant bearing. The coincidence unsettled the officers who reviewed it. Radar ghosts were common, but ghosts that moved with precision were not. And certainly not in that remote stretch of ocean where no friendly units were operating and where Japanese reconnaissance flights were rarely reported. News arrived shortly after noon that the squadron scheduled for the next patrol would depart earlier than planned, hoping to retrace the same corridor the morning patrol had crossed. The goal was simple: determine whether the anomaly was environmental, mechanical, or something else entirely. Halden joined the briefing, standing quietly near the back as the flight leader discussed updated search patterns and emergency procedures should the equipment fail again. The men listened carefully, each aware that a malfunction at altitude or above open water could lead to outcomes far worse than a cracked lens. Before departure, Halden walked to the edge of the flight deck to watch the crews prepare their aircraft. One of the maintenance team pointed to a small metal instrument lying near the tie-down hooks, an old aircraft chronometer, the kind used before modern cockpit clocks became standard. It had been found earlier that morning, resting upright despite the ship's movement, its glass relatively clear, its hands frozen at an unusual time that did not match any recorded event. No one knew who had left it there, and no aircraft in the squadron used that model anymore. Halden picked it up, turning it with a growing sense of unease. The frozen minute hand pointed directly toward the bearing where the radar echo had last appeared. He slipped it into his pocket without speaking. Whatever had happened during the night patrol was not finished yet, and the afternoon flight might be the only chance to understand the pattern before it repeated itself. The afternoon patrol launched under a sky that had shifted into a muted silver haze, the kind that softened the horizon until sea and air seemed to fold into one continuous surface. Lieutenant Halden stood near the catapult crews as the aircraft lifted into the pale light one after another, their engines leaving faint spirals of exhaust that hung briefly above the deck before drifting away. The chronometer he had found earlier rested in the pocket of his flight vest, its frozen hands pressing lightly against his chest with each step, a small but persistent reminder that the morning's anomaly had not been resolved. He did not know whether the instrument had any connection to the cracked lens, but the coincidence of their discovery unsettled him in a way he struggled to rationalize. Once airborne, the patrol settled into a sweeping arc that mirrored the previous night's route. Visibility was fair, though the haze made distances difficult to judge. The lead aircraft maintained steady altitude as the rest of the formation followed, each pilot listening for radio updates while scanning the surface below for debris or irregular wave patterns. Halden flew in the third position, keeping one eye on his compass while studying the ocean for signs of disturbance. The water looked ordinary, marked only by long, shifting lines of current. Yet the deeper he moved into the patrol corridor, the stronger the sense grew that something waited ahead, something unseen but present. At the midpoint of the route, the first instrument failure occurred. A pilot near the rear of the formation reported a brief flicker across his artificial horizon, a sudden tilt followed by a rapid correction. Seconds later, a faint pulse appeared on Halden's radar screen, a thin, wavering line that brightened, dimmed, then disappeared. The lead aircraft requested confirmation, but the pulse had evaporated before Halden could verify. Still, the moment echoed the anomaly from the previous dawn, brief, irregular, and aligned almost perfectly with the patrol's heading. Minutes later, another pilot reported static in his headset, a harsh burst that snapped through the channel and vanished just as quickly. The formation tightened instinctively, maintaining closer spacing as they continued along the mapping route. Halden felt the chronometer shift inside his pocket as the aircraft vibrated against a light crosswind. He reached briefly to secure it, pausing when he felt a faint warmth rising from the metal casing, as if the instrument had been sitting under direct sun rather than tucked away inside a flight vest. He held it for a moment, unsettled by the temperature, then returned his focus to the horizon. As they approached the final leg of the patrol, the haze thickened, growing into a diffuse curtain that softened all visible distances. Halden adjusted his altitude gently, following the lead plane through the mist. Then, without warning, another pulse struck his radar, stronger this time, rising sharply before flattening into a stable echo. It moved parallel to the formation, neither approaching nor retreating, as though matching their speed. Halden's breath tightened as he watched the trace hover at the edge of the display, steady and unervingly deliberate. He reported the contact. The lead aircraft acknowledged, then instructed the formation to maintain heading while attempting to triangulate the signal. For nearly 30 seconds, the echo remained visible, faint but distinct. It drifted slightly, shifted inward, then brightened in a sharp spike that illuminated the entire lower quadrant of Halden's radar. The chronometer in his pocket vibrated faintly in that same instant, its frozen hands trembling as though struck by a brief surge of static. Halden glanced down, startled by the sensation, then looked back at the screen just in time to see the contact collapse into noise. When the radar cleared, the sky ahead looked unchanged, empty, hazy, silent. No aircraft appeared. No shadows broke the brightness. Whatever had triggered the pulse had vanished as completely as the echo from the morning sweep. As the formation turned for the return leg, Halden could not dismiss the unease tightening through his chest. 2 anomalies could be coincidence. 3 suggested a pattern, but a signal that moved with intention, then disappeared, left only uncertainty. And the cracked gunsight lens, resting now in the operations room, felt less like evidence of damage and more like a marker pointing toward something the squadron had not yet understood. By the time the patrol returned to the carrier, the late afternoon light had begun to fade into a cool amber glow, casting long reflections across the water that made the surface appear smoother than it truly was. The aircraft touched down one after another, each landing sending a brief tremor across the deck. Lieutenant Halden stepped out of his plane with a heaviness in his limbs, not from fatigue, but from the weight of questions that had only deepened during the flight. The chronometer in his pocket felt unusually still now, its casing cool once again, as though whatever force had stirred it earlier had receded with the passing haze. In the operations room, the air carried a heightened sense of expectation. Officers gathered around the main plotting table, their voices low but urgent as they compared the new radar logs with those for the previous day. The data revealed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed. Each anomaly had occurred along nearly the same vector, spaced at irregular intervals but aligned with the squadron's returning bearings. The signal had shifted in strength, rising sharply just before collapsing back into background noise, like a heartbeat captured briefly on a faulty monitor. The symmetry between the recordings made it impossible to treat the incidents as mechanical failures alone. Halden laid the chronometer on the table beside the cracked gunsight lens. Together, The two objects created a strange juxtaposition, one shattered, one intact, one found lodged between equipment, the other discovered upright on an open deck. Captain Reeves examined both items carefully, moving them beneath the lamplight to inspect the details. The lens showed its familiar crescent fracture, smooth and almost deliberate. The chronometer's glass, in contrast, bore no damage whatsoever, yet its hands remained fixed at a time that matched neither the morning's radar spike nor the previous night's recorded deviation. Reeves tapped the edge of the casing, listening for the faint click of internal gears, but none responded. The engineering officer arrived with preliminary findings from the radar suite. He explained that the signal registered during the patrol bore an unusually narrow frequency signature, one that did not match Japanese aircraft, American transponders, or known atmospheric interference. It hovered within a band rarely observed at operational altitudes, and its movement suggested momentary tracking capability. The officer hesitated before continuing, as though weighing the implications. He emphasized that while the source could not be identified, it had not behaved like random scatter. It had behaved like something with intention. Reeves leaned back slightly, absorbing the information. His expression remained steady, yet a subtle tension formed in the lines around his eyes. The pattern was becoming too precise to ignore. The cracked lens, the drifting echo, the frozen chronometer, all separate pieces, yet all emerging along the same navigational corridor. Halden found himself studying the fracture once more. He imagined the moment it had broken, the force pressing outward, the light scattering across the glass. The curvature of the crack seemed increasingly unnatural, almost shaped, as though the lens had reacted to a brief pulse rather than a solid impact. As the discussions continued, a message arrived from the lookout tower reporting a faint glimmer spotted near the water surface several miles west of the carrier. The reflection had appeared suddenly, lingered for only a moment, then vanished beneath the swell. It was too distant to identify, but the timing aligned eerily with the final radar disturbance from the patrol. Reeves ordered a recovery boat dispatched immediately, hoping to retrieve anything that might clarify the pattern before nightfall concealed the ocean entirely. Before the officers dispersed, Halden collected the lens and the chronometer, feeling their combined weight settle into his hands. There was no clear explanation yet, only an evolving sense that the squadron's encounters were not isolated mechanical quirks or navigational errors. Something had touched their instruments, disrupted their bearings, and left behind artifacts that bore marks of precision rather than accident. As Halden stepped back onto the deck, the sky darkening above him, he felt a quiet certainty forming. Whatever lay behind the anomalies was closer to revealing itself than it had been at any point before. Night settled slowly over the carrier, spreading across the deck in a gradual deepening of shadow that softened the lines of aircraft, cables, and machinery. The recovery boat returned under dim light, its bow slicing through a surface that had turned almost glass-like in the fading dusk. The sailors carried a single object retrieved from the coordinates of the brief reflection. A small metallic fragment curved along one edge, smooth and polished in a way that seemed out of place amid the harshness of wartime equipment. When laid beside the cracked gunsight lens and the frozen chronometer, the fragment deepened the sense that these scattered pieces belonged to one sequence of events rather than separate incidents. Yet the shape offered no obvious mechanical role, no mounting points, and no familiar markings. Inside the operations room, Captain Reeves studied the three objects in silence. The metallic fragment bore faint parallel striations, almost like the trace left by a controlled vibration rather than by water or impact. The chronometer remained frozen at its impossible time, its internal gears unmoved despite repeated attempts to reset them, and the lens, fractured in its elegant crescent, seemed to reflect each lamplight flicker as though acknowledging the others. None of the objects were inherently threatening, yet together they painted a picture of a moment that resisted clear explanation. As officers reviewed the radar logs once more, the repeated pulsing signature, appearing, stabilizing, and dissolving, could no longer be dismissed as atmospheric interference. It had responded to the formation's movement, matched their speed, and vanished only when conditions obscured visibility. Whether it had been an experimental Japanese device, a rare meteorological pattern, or something entirely unfamiliar, no one could say, but its effect was unmistakable. The cracked lens, the disrupted bearings, the shifting signal, all suggested a brief encounter with a phenomenon the squadron had not been trained to interpret. Halden remained near the table long after the others stepped away, his gaze steady on the line where the fracture curved across the glass. Whatever had met his patrol in the night had left behind no visible shape, no identifiable silhouette, only distorted readings, interrupted instruments, and fragments carrying marks too deliberate to be accidental. The sea had already begun its slow task of burying whatever else lay below the surface, and no second reflection appeared to guide them. By the time Halden stepped onto the darkened deck, the hum of the carrier blended with the soft rhythm of waves striking the hull. The night offered no answers, only the quiet certainty that not every encounter in wartime was defined by the familiar sound of engines or gunfire. Some left traces far smaller, yet no less real. Traces carried in the form of a cracked lens, a silent chronometer, and a fragment whose purpose remained unknown, marking the place where understanding had briefly faltered in the vastness of the Pacific. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.